uh, to see how it is in motion, um, and give you some tips. So we hope that you walk away today feeling a little bit more confident, a little bit more assured, in what this and your role in this in the year to come. So with that, let's get started. In the chat box, as you're all starting to join us this morning, would love for you to share with us a few things. The first is describe your teaching experience in a line or two. Have you taught before? What have you taught? Where have you taught? What age group? Um, what you can share. Maybe you've tutored. Um, all of that's relevant to us. And if you could take a moment in the chat box and just share with us in a line or two what that experience has looked like for you. Okay, so we have kindergarten assistant teaching, peer tutoring, tutored high school, college students. Awesome, thanks for sharing. Taught lab section for bio in college, climate change class, 6th grade. Ooh, 2nd grade ESL and 8th grade pre-AP. I saw some more ESL lessons in there. ESL to community college students, tutor kindergarten, peer advising in college. So all of you, okay, ooh, organic chem for 2 years. Volunteered at a refugee center, after school counselor for ELS. Excellent. So I imagine a lot of you have, aside from your own academic experience as being a learner, that many of you have had some role in teaching or tutoring or assisting someone in their education. And that's probably what's led you to where you are right now in this experience. But it's really helpful to keep in mind. The reason why we ask is to get a bit of a better understanding of what maybe your encounters with classroom management have been. So with that in mind, here's my next question for you all. What questions do you have about classroom management? Maybe what concerns is also another way to read this. So if you could take a moment and share with us in the chat box what questions you have, or maybe what concerns you have about it. And that will help us to better address these as well in our presentation today. How do you gain respect from students so that they listen to you? Keeping students engaged and keeping their attention, managing bigger classes of kids who may not understand what you're saying. Engagement is a big one, especially with larger classes. First impressions, how to set that tone. How to keep things in track if you see behavior going astray. How to build intrinsic motivation. These are big topics, and even veteran teachers definitely grapple with these. So today I want to just kind of set some expectations. We're introducing this topic to you with the understanding that some of you have more experience in the classroom than others. But I also want you to know and be assured that this is not a topic that we're one and done. That today is the only opportunity for us to address it. Later in the semester, I will be doing another follow-up workshop at many of your sites later in the semester. So after you've spent some time in the classroom here in Taiwan and have really gotten your hands wet, your feet wet, I should say, and been able to really cultivate maybe more of where you see your strengths in this topic, as well as areas that you would like to improve or where you're struggling. And be able to address this in a later workshop. So just keep that in mind. But that said, I think it's really helpful for you all as we go through this today. If you have pen and paper nearby or a way to take notes, I think that'll be helpful for you, because some of the things that we're going to suggest to you might be things that you feel really comfortable with and want to remember and keep in your wheelhouse. And there might be things that perhaps stretch you a little bit, that are maybe new ideas that you want to come back to. Whatever way helps you in this. Of course, we are recording today's session. We will be posting this in the Google Classroom for you for future reference as well. But I do recommend that you find a way to, sorry, I'm having a little technical difficulty here, that you find a way to help kind of retain some of these ideas, especially since your emergence into the classroom is going to be a little bit different than in a typical school year, with your arrival coming after the school year has already started. So here's where I'm going to need your help again. So get ready to do a little typing again in the chat box. I have a statement here with a missing word. So we're going to read through this, and I'd like for you to predict what you think that missing word is. And you can write it in the chat box. So this is the quote. If a child doesn't know how to read, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to swim, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to multiply, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to drive, we teach. If a child doesn't know how to behave, we. So fill in that last blank with what you think the missing word is. Learn, teach, model, show, model, lead, love. Wow, these are such positive words. I love it. More for modeling. Okay. Any other ideas there? Listen, lead, lots of very positive ideas. So this might shock you that this quote from Tom Herner, who is the president of the National Association for Directors of Education, said punish. So think about that for a moment, and how we often react to misbehavior or malbehavior in society, in our classrooms, and how we often deal with that. When we see that a child doesn't know how to behave, how often do we not think about the need to teach or to listen or to love or to model, but how often our first reaction is to punish? So my question for you, and I'd be curious to see how you answer this, and again in the in the chat box, is why do you think this is so often true? Why is this so often the case? Are you hoping that I'll answer this for you? We're quick to assume that they know better and are purposely misbehaving. I would agree that very often we think it's intentional, that misbehavior. Any other ideas or contributions to this idea? We view it as intentional behavior, just out of aggravation. It's harder to think of constructive approach. We want to nip the problem in the bud, don't have time to address the central issue, maybe don't have other tools to manage that behavior. All of these are so very true, right? And perhaps we have our own experience with this, or certainly have seen it in context. I bring this up because I want you to keep that in mind, that you will encounter students who don't behave or do exactly what you want to do in the classroom at times. And think about how your initial reaction to that might be. Will you immediately think to punish, or will you think of it as an opportunity to teach? And sometimes we have to retrain ourselves and how we view that context. Also keep in mind that you will not be the only adult in the classroom. And so your co-teacher may have also some very different ideas about how to address behavior. And that's something that Tom will address a little bit more later on in our workshop today. So I think this all kind of brings us back to the all important question is like, how do you define classroom management? So again, utilizing that chat box feature, if you could take a moment and think about what your own personal definition for this is and share it with us. Not losing control of the classroom, being able to complete your scheduled lesson, being able to facilitate learning in the best way, level of engagement, how to run the classroom during teaching and student activities, everything that happens in the classroom that isn't strictly academic content. Creating a learning space that allows for different learning styles to be successful. Ensuring students always know what they're supposed to do and want to do, level of comfort, engagement, creating supportive, productive environment that meets students' needs. So lots of ideas here, and some of them are more expansive than others. But one thing that I'm hearing from a lot of you that it's more than just managing the academic learning, like that it's just about control of academic learning, that it's a bit more encompassing. And we'll talk about this a bit more in a moment. Another question I'd like for you to think about is, and share with us in the chat box, is what does a well-managed classroom look like to you? So when you think about your experience and you've come across a classroom to which you would describe as that seems well managed, what's going on in that classroom? What are you seeing? Students are attentive and involved. The lesson is given smoothly. Students engage and attentive. Teachers aware and responsive to student needs. Students are learning and inquisitive, having fun, connecting with one another, growing. Students know what to do even if the teacher steps out for a moment. There's a sense of being on track, they're on task. Know to ask questions, there's organization. So what I'm kind of hearing from some of you without maybe explicitly saying is sometimes when we see a well-managed classroom, we know it. Like we may not be able to say all the things that we see necessarily, but we know one that is well managed from one that isn't, right? Now my last question for you, and this is an important one, especially thinking about your future role as an ETA, is how do you see your role in classroom management? So how do you, when you think about your upcoming teaching experience in Taiwan as a co-teacher in the classroom, how do you see yourself in relation to this idea of classroom management? checking in with students, helping anyone who's struggling in the lesson, support co-teachers and giving lesson, helping keeping students engaged and active. I'm curious, do any of you see yourselves as an active classroom manager, or that you will be? Most importantly, having a willingness to be flexible and learn from the class along with students themselves. The novelty of having a foreign teacher might be unique for our classroom management situations. This is very true. That is definitely a consideration to keep in mind. Any final thoughts on your role as a classroom manager? One thing, and this is not something, helping to set the tone and expectations in the class, for sure. So this is not an explicit question that you need to answer right now, but one that I hope you are thinking about is, what is your comfort with classroom management? And as we come to define it a little bit more and understand, have a better, more encompassing view of it, and within the context of Taiwan especially, I want you to really think about what it is about it that would be comfortable for you. What are the areas that are not feeling so comfortable for you, and how you might address that in the year ahead. So with that in mind, let's talk about this idea of classroom management. Make sure that we're kind of on the same page. A lot of you touched upon these ideas. So I think a lot of you already kind of share this idea that classroom management can be defined as the actions teachers take to establish and sustain this environment that really fosters students' academic achievement, but also their social, emotional, and moral growth. So we understand that it's not just about the academics, and that's really helping to facilitate this environment. So it's quite a big and broad definition. And you're right, building and establishing a rapport is a really big part of that. We're going to talk more about that in just a moment. This definition comes from Dr. Carol Simon Weinstein and her colleague. And she's kind of known in education circles as a guru about classroom management, has a ton of books on this topic. And I really like this definition because I think it shows that classroom management is a lot of things. And as we see today, there are a lot of different components and ways that we can approach it and tackle it, if you will. But ultimately, what my takeaway from this, and what I hope yours is as well, is that the goal of classroom management is to create a sense of order, for the sake of learning, not just for the sake of order or just for the sake of control, but really helping to create that environment that facilitates ease in learning. So some of those key components, and this was just touched upon, is in fact, yes, building rapport, so key to what we do in the classroom. It's also about setting boundaries and rules and expectations, and doing so early on and being quite transparent about it. We want to make sure too that when issues come up, that we're really addressing the reason behind, the root of the problem, rather than reacting to the problem. And we want to make sure, and I think another really key component is involving parents and guardians. So those other key factors and people in our students' lives. We're going to take a look at each of these components a little bit more in depth. And here's a good part for you to perhaps take some notes. Some of these might seem quite logical and things that you would inherently do, but some of these might be new ideas for you and things to remember. All right. So when it comes to building rapport, one thing that's going to be super key is learning your students' names. And that might seem like an easy enough thing to do. If you're working in a smaller school with a smaller student population, hopefully that won't pose too big of a challenge. But you might end up in a larger school or teaching a lot of students in your school. and might find yourself with, say, 500 students, which was my situation last year when I was in Kaohsiung. Between two schools, I had 500 students. So learning their names was a bit of a challenge. You also, I think, really helpful to this is understanding your students' interests. What do they like? What are they interested in? Think about how will your students get to know you? So where will there be opportunities for your kids to find out a little bit more about the person that you are? One way to do this is sharing your journey to learn Chinese. Some of you may already have a really good grasp on the language. And some schools have a lot of different policies around this. If they know that you speak Chinese, they may ask that you don't use it in the classroom. Other schools are quite okay with you using it. But I think what's always helpful for kids is seeing that just as they are shy and struggling to find words and meaning with English, that if they see that you're in a similar journey with their native language, it can be a really, nice bonding moment. One thing I also recommend doing is standing at the door to greet students as they come into class. This is not something that a lot of Taiwanese teachers do. And so if you have the opportunity to do this, I think it's a great way for kids to see and kind of set a tone of friendly start to class. And it's a great way for you to remember their names or ask them if you're forgetting. There isn't the formality of sort of recess per se, as we talked about last week with giving you an overview of the typical school day schedule. There are longer breaks between classes. Some are 10 minutes, some are 20 minutes. There's quite a long lunch break that usually encompasses nap time. But this time between classes is a great time if you are available to really engage with kids in a more casual way. I know some ETs in the past have gone outside to play with kids. And, if there's like a basketball court, shoot some hoops with them. Sometimes I've brought in games like little mini Jenga sets or card games that I'll set up and invite kids to play with. And it's a nice way for them to feel less intimidated and that you're an approachable, friendly person. And when they think of you as a friendly person, they tend to behave a lot better too. Some ETAs have also in the past thought to join their students in after-school activities that are held at the school. So this is another place where you could certainly easily engage with kids. And another idea that came about last year that one ET had a lot of success with, and this is an idea that several others emulated in their classes, is setting up a letterbox. So taking like an old shoebox of sorts and decorating it and allowing students to write small letters or notes to you that they can leave when you're not in the classroom and that you can check and then write letters back to them. This is especially, I think, helpful for shyer students who may feel a little bit scared to come and try to talk to you, and kind of keeps it a little bit more less intimidating with that face-to-face instant contact. I think another really important thing to consider is establishing those positive relationships with your co-teachers and your students' homeroom teachers. The homeroom teacher concept is really strong here. As we explained last week, that students will be grouped with their fellow classmates, particularly in the elementary and junior high grades, with their classmates for 2 years, and have the same homeroom teacher. And this is where most of their classes will be taught, is in their homeroom, that homeroom classroom. And their homeroom teachers are going to be the main contacts to parents. So they're ones who will be very familiar with students, their issues, understanding what's going on, perhaps at home, and having a bit more context. So if you're seeing issues arise in your classroom, they're often a good first line of contact. So establishing a good relationship with them and letting them know who you are and your role will be, I think, really helpful. When it comes to setting boundaries and rules and expectations, some ideas and things to be mindful of is, of course, we want to be friendly with our kids, but I think it's also really important to find that line and make sure that you're not seen as their friend. This can get really tricky if there are times where you have to enforce things, and if you're regarded too much as their buddy, that may make your role as a classroom manager quite a bit more difficult. One thing too that's going to be a little challenging for you right now, and something that as you get to know your school and start to establish a relationship and contact and communication with your your future co-teachers, is to find out what their routines are. What is their routine for at the start of class? Are there routines around turning in homework or starting group activities? Do they have routines for transitions in class from one activity to the next? What is their routine for ending class? These might not be things that your co-teachers will inherently think to share with you. So these are questions for you to ask of them, and I think really important ones, so that you can help with maintaining these routines. Or if you have suggestions for other ways of doing them, you can bring that to the table. Just as with that, it's going to be important for you to know what the rules are. And I think that's an important thing to know before the first day you are in person coming into the classroom. Obviously, a lot of this stuff is being established right now in classrooms as school started last week on the 1st. So a lot of teachers spend time in the first day of school talking about rules and making sure students are aware of them. It's important for you to know what they are. And making sure that you're, reinforcing them and understanding how these are shared with students and how they're enforced. And on that note, one rule that I like to live by is, and I think will be a little bit challenging because you're not necessarily going to be an active part of creating those classroom rules per se, just because of the timeliness of when you're coming into the school year here. But something to keep in mind is having only rules that you can enforce and making sure that you enforce every rule. So really being consistent. I don't believe in arbitrary rules. If it's not something that you're going to actively enforce, I don't believe that it's worth having because then it's not taken seriously by students or anyone for that matter. And one thing also to keep in mind is part of setting rules and boundaries and expectations is also in how you deliver instructions. And this is something we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth further on. But this is a place where I see a lot of classroom issues stem from, and where a lesson can really devolve is because instructions weren't given clearly. They're not understood by kids. So when we have students not understanding what to do, this is when they start to do whatever they want to do. And you can start to see behavior issues creep in. It might be helpful for you to learn some classroom commands in Mandarin, not so much for you to use, but for you to understand when your co-teacher may use them and be able to have a better sense of what's being said or directed at students. And I think on that same note, it's going to be helpful to know what classroom commands students are taught in English. A lot of the books, if you had a chance to look at the textbooks that we shared with you online in Google Classroom, they often begin with classroom English. And a lot of those are commands like stand up, raise your hand, sit down. These are important commands because they're ones that you're going to use a lot. And so if that isn't being explicitly taught, that's something for you to find out and to perhaps, I would strongly encourage, build some lessons and review around. Teaching it just singularly one time is not going to be enough. I think it's helpful to revisit throughout the year. And really important is having a reward system. A lot of teachers utilize this in their classrooms. More so than I could have ever imagined from what I've seen here. So finding out how your co-teachers reward students will be really helpful for you, and finding out ways that you can help to reinforce these rewards will be also really key and helpful with those sort of extrinsic motivation. So continuing on, when we want to, one really important thing with classroom management, so that we can avoid this sort of knee-jerk reaction that many people often have to punish behavior, is really to find out what's really going on. What is the root of the problem? To help us with this, things to consider is understanding that how you address the problem will very much depend on what the problem is. So that's in part what makes this topic a little bit challenging, is we'll give you tips, we'll give you ideas, but ultimately it's going to be up to understanding what the problem is to know how best to address it. There isn't always going to be this one size fits all approach. One thing that can help alleviate this, if we think about how we greet students, and I think that's a really important thing, is setting a tone, a positive tone at the beginning of class. But those moments where, for example, the suggestion I have to greet students at the door, allows you to also assess students as they come in to their emotional state. You can see if they've been running around and maybe are really hyped up and need some moments to calm down. You can see if they're upset. You could see if they're just happy-go-lucky and ready for the day. You can see if they're tired or if they look sick. All of this will help inform you of what is coming into your classroom and what you're about to face, especially when it comes to managing your students collectively. So you might also want to think about having some sort of greeting that allows you to kind of gauge this a little bit further. And it's going to be helpful to also think about what relationship your students have with their co-teacher and home teachers. I think it's also where we see sometimes behavior really creep up is when we see kids disengage. Is it because they're bored? Is it because the content's too easy? Is it too hard? If students don't think they're going to be successful, they're going to create a lot of diversion to not attract your attention around the fact that they don't know how to do something. They don't want to show something that may reveal their weakness or vulnerability. So you might see kids trying to be, cheeky and the class clown. Same as if something is too easy or they're bored, they're going to try to create diversion to entertain themselves and probably try to take some students with them. So things to keep in mind, and why it's important to really address then, if that's the case, what's going on in your lesson and how you're teaching it. Another thing to keep in mind is that, and be mindful of, our students with special needs. And this is something that is addressed, I think, quite unevenly in schools around Taiwan. I've been in schools where they have special education classrooms. And one of the schools that I taught at, we even were able to have a paraprofessional come in and work with one of our students who had a lot of disruptive behavior. And that was a tremendous help. But I would say that's not the usual typical situation. And there are some schools and teachers who feel very uncomfortable and deal with students with special needs by, frankly, just ignoring them. So having a better understanding of how your school addresses this is going to be helpful for you. And this might be a good question to ask your co-teachers of how student needs are addressed, especially if it's understood that a student has some extra challenges in their academic development. I think it's also, with this, good to find out what's going on at home and how families are addressing this. Some of the special needs that I encountered among my students came from the fact that they didn't have strong family support at home. In some cases, students were without a parent or parents, which definitely adversely affected their behavior. I think also just remember keeping your eyes open and on students. Don't turn your back on kids too long. This is when things can kind of go awry. So when you're giving instructions, if you're writing something on the board, don't spend a lot of time with your back to kids. If your eyes are not on them, making sure that your co-teacher's eyes are, and kind of having that sort of tandem will be really helpful. But I also say this because I think it's important to observe your students and find out and learn of their behavior um, when they don't think of you actively looking at them. So when you're seeing them during an activity or during breaks, watching them, just casually observing them and seeing how they're interacting with others. If are they playing the role of friend or bully, and also just seeing what their interests are. These all inform you as to who they are and what they're dealing with and how that might impact what goes on in the classroom. And the last part I want to address with classroom management here in this part is how we can involve parents and guardians. And this might seem quite removed from you. I can really best suggest that you work through the homeroom teacher. That often in schools, this is the person who's established to have the most direct contact with parents. And so rather than independently seek out the parents and figure out how to contact them, I really encourage you to work through the homeroom teacher if you feel that parental communication is needed. You might want to think about writing a letter of introduction for yourself that you can have printed up and sent out with kids so that parents understand who you are and what your role is. I think it's also helpful to ask what sort of lines of communication already exist in the school. Some schools have a very active parent-teacher association, and with parents being very actively involved, and other schools don't have as strong of this. So it will be helpful for you to find out what's there. A lot of schools will print up a special calendar book. Sometimes it's referred to as a communication book, and this is where kids will write their homework or special notes. And it's kind of understood that this is where homeroom teachers and classroom subject teachers will communicate with parents through this book. So it's a good place to kind of affix notes to parents to let them know of things that are coming up. There are parent-teacher conferences, generally in the fall. There might be in the spring as well. And there's an opportunity for parents to come in and meet their kids' teachers. Some schools will say, as an ETA, you don't need to come, but I would encourage you to go. It's a good way for you to make your presence known. I think it's always helpful, if you can, to establish some sort of contact and communication with parents to let them know who you are. I can only see a benefit in you attending that. So if you are aware of it and are able to, I encourage you to do so. You might also want to think about how you can create homework that involves parents to complete. And I'm not saying to do this every day or to make it a very arduous thing for parents, but if there's a way to have parents sign off on something or allow students to interview their parents and use language that you're teaching them in class, this helps the parents to become a bit more involved and understand what their kids are learning. And I can only see that being a strength to the work that you're doing within the classroom and keeping that communication going. Another thing you should be aware of is sports day. And this is another place where you can get to know some of your students' parents. So sports day happens usually later in the fall at every school. And it's like a massive big field day. It's usually on a Saturday. And every class will prepare some different games and activities. There'll be track races. It's a really fun day. There's fundraising that the parent-teacher organization will often help to set up booths that sell food. It's kind of like a school fair, and it's a lot of fun. And your school may ask you to help with running one of the activities. Whatever your responsibility may or may not be on that day, I encourage you also to attend. Even if it's not required or your school doesn't, talk it up with you, I encourage you to go because it's a way to see your kids again outside of the classroom, having fun. And a lot of parents come and they'll be really excited to introduce you to their parents. Yeah, so I mentioned before about the Parent Teacher Association. A lot of schools have them. And I also encourage you, if you also want to find a way to connect more with parents, is try to leave school sometimes when the kids do, when they're released from school, because parents will be picking up their students very often. And if you're just kind of moseying and taking your time out of school, you know, kids will be excited to see you outside of the classroom, and again may, you know, point you out to their parents. And that can be another opportunity where you can go up and introduce yourself and establish contact. So I think finding those moments where you can get to know more about who your students are outside of the classroom context will really help you to understand what's going on with them, to address maybe issues or challenges you see happening, but also create a more fortified approach to helping these students and really creating, you know, the most ideal environment for them to learn. All right, some things to keep in mind about classroom management within the Taiwanese context. So here's kind of a laundry list of things to keep in mind that may be useful to know. Sugar does not have a big role or any role in school lunch. School lunches are served not in a cafeteria as they are in American schools. So lunch is brought to on like a trolley to each classroom in sort of a family style. And students will come with their own utensils and dishes and will self-serve. One thing that was explained to me is that schools are mandated that they cannot serve like sugary snacks or desserts. So usually if there's a dessert provided, it'll be like a piece of fruit. And I think it's important to note this because this is helpful that, and keeping in mind, you're not going to have, it's unlikely you'll have kids who are on like some big sugar high. And that will be, you know, detrimentally affecting their behavior in the classroom. Most schools have some sort of uniform, you know, to ranging from just maybe t-shirts that distinguish them by grade or class, to full on, you know, different uniforms for PE versus, or sport kind of days versus more formal attire. There is no formal recess, so those breaks between classes are when kids run out and play. And there isn't really any adult supervision, so there's no teacher who is tasked with being on, you know, recess duty and watching over kids. And that's important to keep in mind because things might happen outside that no adult is really aware of that might end up being brought into the classroom. And something that I would often try to do if I didn't have to worry about setting up for the next class is I would, again, stand at the door and kind of watch and see what's going on in the schoolyard or in the halls. And that was informative to me. And if I did see things happening, I would often kind of interject or, you know, say, hey now, you know, say something to kids to correct behavior before it escalated. I think it's also important, and we've mentioned this before, that few classrooms are going to be air conditioned. And even in October, when you're finally in classrooms teaching, it's still going to be hot here. And so keeping in mind that the effect that weather can have on student behavior is important. They're going to be hot. They're going to have, a lot of them will have their own little individual fans. There will be fans throughout the classrooms. This is pretty ubiquitous. But you'll be competing with that sound often. Kids will often have, you know, a lot of paraphernalia with them to help cool off. So their little mini fans, their water bottles. And then the converse is true in winter, although it doesn't snow per se, except maybe up in the mountains. And that's unlikely something you'll encounter because it's so humid here when the temperature does drop. And even if it's, you know, 40 degrees Fahrenheit, that's quite cold, especially given that buildings here are not insulated. So you'll have students who are bundled up. They'll be totally in like scarves and gloves and hats and, you know, big winter jackets. And it may not seem, depending on where in the US you're coming from, particularly cold for you, but they will be cold, and how that might affect, you know, their behavior. So thinking about how you incorporate movement in your classroom is something to keep in mind. Probably when it's really hot, you may not want to have things that are too active in the classroom, versus when they are cold, you may want to incorporate things that allow them to move around and kind of warm up. I think it's also important to think about what is considered okay, for maybe rectifying behavior around punishments and things you might see that you may be not so accustomed to seeing in classrooms. I have experienced this and seen, yelling seems to be a bit more common and more accepted in classrooms. Teachers yelling at students individually or collectively as a class. I've seen it more commonly that teachers will single out students. Very often will tell a student who's misbehaving, or if they're addressing the whole class, to stand up. And they may have to stand up for an indefinite period of time. Sometimes teachers will have kids stay after class to help clean up, or have like a mini detention where they're not able to go out and enjoy themselves during the break. And will very often, coerce an apology out of them after a bit of a verbal reaming. So this is probably what I've seen. You will not see, or you should not see any sort of like corporal physical punishment. And I think if that's something you do witness, that's definitely bring that to our attention. That is not okay. Textbook curriculum also is a place where, we talked about kind of best practices before of wanting to know what your students' interests are. You want to make English relevant to your students. If you're in a more rural community, students may not really connect with how English can be helpful to them in their lives. They may only see, their context. So whatever you're doing, you want to make sure that you are relating what you're doing in the classroom to their lives. And the textbooks don't always do a great job of doing this. They can be very helpful in providing structure, but they don't generally ask questions or create a sort of critical thinking of how we're tying this language that we're teaching them in the book to what students are interested in or what's going on in their lives. So you have an opportunity there to help bridge that. Also, most classrooms you'll find are arranged in rows of individual desks. So a lot of learning is kind of more teacher focused. You will find some classrooms that don't have these individual desks that have tables, but I don't think they're as commonly found. And again, you will find some teachers who are definitely on board and eager to do student group work, but you may find some teachers who don't feel very comfortable with this. So understand that there'll be a range of this, and that can very much affect classroom management, and it can also stem from their beliefs around classroom management, that it's just maybe sometimes easier not to deal with students in groups because they get too crazy and wild. We've talked already about homeroom teachers and the role that they play. And we've also talked about the importance of reward systems. This can be a massive motivator. One of the teachers I worked with, she would give students a bonus page that they would glue into their student book at the beginning of the year. And then as a classroom routine, when they would walk into class, if they were prepared from the moment that we started class, so they had their student book out, they had their pencil case, they had the supplies they needed for that day, and were seated and ready to go with their name tag on, then I would come around and I would give them a stamp in their bonus point. And after they accrued a certain number of bonus points, they could redeem them for different treats or different experiences. And one of them, the experiences was to take a photograph with me, Teacher Kara, which I thought was really funny, but some of them really got excited by that reward. So rewards don't have to be things that you spend money on, is I guess my point. But it is a huge motivator and maybe even expectation that kids have. With that, though, understand that praise is not something that is commonly given. You probably won't find a lot of teachers openly, acknowledge kids doing a good job. Um, so that can be also something you think about and how you might want to incorporate more of that, because I do find students tend to positively respond to, genuine praise. Um, Also, something to keep in mind is that every class will have a student leader, and this student is often responsible for helping to move students from the homeroom classroom to other classes. So if you're not teaching in the homeroom but have a dedicated English classroom, the student leader will often be the one who's helping to bring the students over. They'll often be the ones who have the attendance book and will give it to your co-teacher to fill out. So there is some of this sort of inherent structures that are in place. I don't know that these students have much more of a role in that. They could, but they shouldn't play like a more like active role in classroom management other than that. And I think it's important also to be aware that if students fail English, and this is particularly true in elementary school, there isn't any real dire consequence to students. To teachers, maybe, if they fail their whole class, that's a reflection on what's happening with your teaching. But if a student doesn't pass their English class, they don't necessarily get held back. The school might have a remedial class for them that they need to take and stay after school for, but very often, they're able to continue and progress in their education. So what that means also is that you might have kids who haven't passed their previous English classes and come in with very low levels. You might find students at the middle school level who still don't know their ABCs, and that might really shock you as to why and how that could be. But I think it's in part because of this. Something also just to give kind of a bigger perspective on is children within Taiwan. A lot of Taiwanese are waiting later and later to have kids, and so they can focus on career. So there's less time for children and there are less kids. So by the time that they're having children, they're a bit later in their lives often. There's less discipline happening sometimes at home. More tendency for letting kids get what they want as a way to to coerce them into behaving. And keeping in mind that a lot of students, right after they finish school with you, they're going to a cram school or bushiban. Not necessarily to learn English, though some of them will. There's lots of other subjects that are offered, and very often these schools are a form of daycare. So a lot of times they're not coming home until 8 or 9 o'clock at night. And so they're spending not a lot of time with their parents. Because fewer kids are being born and parents are having them later, a lot of people rely on fertility treatments. You're going to probably find that there's more occurrence of twins in classrooms. I had multiple sets of twins. I was quite surprised. So that can also make getting to know who your students are a little bit more challenging, trying to keep straight who's who. But it also has an effect on school enrollment. So a lot of schools are seeing quite a significant decrease in student enrollment, and schools are actually starting to close up. And that's something to keep in mind. Also, it's not uncommon for families to live in multi-generational homes. So you won't just have mom and dad at home, but very likely a grandma and grandpa as well. So some things to keep in mind is to make time to plan how you're going to introduce and guide students through activities. Be careful with the shh, as a way to keep kids quiet. If you employ that, you might see a lot of kids snickering because that sound is often associated with potty training to get kids to go to the bathroom when they're little toddlers. Also keep in mind the power of proximity and the teacher look. Sometimes if you're noticing a little misbehavior going on, kids being distracted, just walking closer to that student can help nip that issue in the bud and re-engage them rather quickly. And this will probably be very true for a lot of you, is students may not understand your role. You may not understand your role, to be quite honest. You'll be probably spending some time trying to figure out, to what degree you're an assistant in the classroom to a full-on equal co-teacher, and trying to negotiate what that looks like with your co-teachers. And that definitely has an effect on how students might see you in the classroom as well. So again, kind of going back to that question of what's your comfort around being an authority figure in the classroom and around managing student behavior. So, keeping in mind how you're going to do this with another teacher, and revisiting these sort of conversations around rules and routines are really important. And again, keep in mind that these aren't things that necessarily your co-teacher is going to bring to you. I really put that on you to bring to your teacher, and I encourage you to do that before you start in-person teaching. Some ETAs have gone about this, creating kind of a good cop, bad cop. I don't know that I advocate that. I don't condemn it either, but some co-teachers, have that sort of dynamic. Keep in mind also what students' feelings towards English are. You might be surprised not every student is super excited to learn English. And so they may tune it out when they hear it, especially around instructions. And the role of native language is really important in this case, because if your co-teacher is quick to give instructions in Chinese, like maybe you're giving it in English, and then students just sit there and don't seem to know what to do, and may be sort of inherently trained to just wait until your co-teacher explains it in Chinese, will also sort of diminish your authority in those situations. There's also a certain novelty that some kids will have around more fun English, if you will, like swearing and slang. So I definitely encountered this from time to time with kids. I had one kid who was often if he didn't understand something, he would just say, "What the hell?" Which is really not appropriate for a 10-year-old to say in classroom. And so while I kind of had a bit of a chuckle about it, I couldn't really actually show that I was amused by it, because I just encouraged him to say it. And your co-teacher may not be aware to some of those nuances. So if you do see some language being used that kids have picked up, from movies or, from elsewhere outside of the classroom that may not be super appropriate, that's something you can also bring to your co-teacher and figure out a way to address. And something also to think about are your own biases and stereotypes of how students behave, maybe particularly Asian children, and maybe even your ideas of how teachers should behave and manage classrooms. So things to think and reflect on. So with that, that was a lot of me talking, but I'd like to kind of pick your brain about what concerns this might bring up for you in classroom management. So if you could take a moment and comment on this in the chat box, would love to hear what concerns this leaves you with. What if my LAT and I disagree about how a situation should be handled? Clashing with co-teachers on management ideas, that communication with parents, the home teacher. Yeah, those are very legitimate concerns, and I think one of the things I can advise you to do right now is, as soon as you know who your co-teachers are, is it acceptable for the LAT to use less English or use less Chinese? I'll get to that in a minute. So as you are coming to know where you're going to be teaching when you come to Taiwan and who you're going to be teaching with, I encourage you to spend as much time as you can reaching out to those teachers. They may not have a lot of time. They may not be as quick to respond to you because they have a lot going on right now. But the more you can communicate and try to set up actual phone conversations if you can, or, you know, whatever they're comfortable with, let's put it that way, where you can ask some of these questions and find out what they are before you actually come into the classroom, I think will be helpful to getting on the same page and understanding that there might be more ideas around classroom management. I think when there's disagreements about how things are handled, the best thing is to address them when there aren't students present and maybe when emotions aren't heightened, and finding, you know, a time between classes, or if you have a prep period with your co-teacher, to bring up how you might handle those situations in the future, and how you would like to handle it, and find out how they prefer to handle it. It's not to say that you will find agreement all the time. There might be times where there has to be some level of compromise. But I think the more you can do to try to be proactive in that communication, and address it in a way that doesn't cause someone to lose face, I think will be really, really important. As for Chinese in the classroom, like, I think that is going to be, everyone has a different sort of threshold. I think I prefer a classroom that is in English, that you utilize every moment that you can, using English, but not to vilify native language whatsoever, not to punish its use or forbid its use. But I do think that very often teachers will rely on it as a check for understanding or to give instructions because there's limited time and it's just quicker because you know students are more likely to understand. And so I think there sometimes is an over-reliance on Chinese around giving instructions to kids, and checking for their understanding. And I think this is where it's important to think through the instructions that you're giving so that you can start to move away from that over-reliance. But that is a process and that takes time, especially if you're working with a teacher who that is her mode or his mode of teaching, and that's how they've been doing it for quite some time. So those are things to be mindful of. Speaking of that co-teaching relationship, I'm going to hand this over to Tom now, who's going to talk a little bit more about some of those nuances of working with another teacher in the classroom.
Thank you, Kara. Okay, so a lot of what I'm going to cover I'm going to try and get through this pretty quickly, just because Kara already gave you guys such excellent information, such excellent tips. So I'm going to go through this quickly, but before I begin, I just want to ask you guys what you think of this definition. Do you think does this look like a good definition to you? Co-teaching? Is anything missing or is it perfect? What do you think? Scrutinize, criticize. What do you think? Good, bad, terrible, amazing? Multiple teachers. Okay. It's a good edit. Any other edits? Suggested edits? Criticism? I know you guys are tired, so I'm just going to say I think there's maybe some qualifying adjectives missing. There's some vagueness here, and in a way that's on purpose. Something that I think you've taken away from everything that Kara said is that every situation is different, every context is different, and so maybe you have to be vague, you have to be a little bit open with your definition on purpose. But yeah, I feel like there's some qualifying adjectives missing here, but it's an academic definition, and sometimes they are very cut and dry like this. So yeah, I'm just going to talk quickly about co-teaching and classroom management, and then I think after that, are we taking a break? I'm not sure. Yes. Okay, good. All right, so let's go to the next slide. So of all of these co-teaching models, there are 6 here up on the screen. I'm going to get tired of saying this, and you're probably going to get tired of hearing this, but it depends on who your co-teacher is, and it depends on what kind of school you're teaching. Okay, thank you, Effie. Which one of these co-teaching models do you think would be best in terms of maintaining effective classroom management? Which one of these models is best in terms of managing the classroom? What do you guys think? One teach, one observe, one teach, one assist, station teaching, parallel teaching. Just choose one. Which one do you think works best when it comes to managing a classroom? And think about what Kara discussed and what you put in the chat earlier. I'm making you think a little bit here. Okay, Allison, one teach, one assist. Okay. Another vote for one teach, one assist, or observe, one teach, one assist. Okay. Alternative. All right, so we're going to start to see, we're going to start to see more and more differing opinions here. One teach, one assist, or tag team traditional. All right, I mean, look, I don't think there is a right or wrong answer here. I think, again, it depends on your context, but it's something that you have to discuss with your co-teacher. And that's, if you only take away one thing from because we're going to give you guys tons of co-teaching workshops later on that really delve deep into each of these models. So I'm not going to talk about them too much now. Really, it's just what you and your co-teacher decide works best for your context. If station teaching works the best for that particular lesson objective, go with station teaching. If alternative teaching works best based on the activity you have planned, go with that. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, yeah, we already covered that question. So obviously, co-teaching doesn't start when you step into the classroom. It starts 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 days before. Hopefully not 5 minutes, but that could happen. Your co-teacher could run up to you and say, hey, the schedules got changed. I know we haven't planned for this lesson yet, but can you come and teach a lesson about whatever? And then you have 5 minutes to maybe do a quick search online for something and throw together a lesson plan. But hopefully you have a little bit more time to sit down with your co-teacher and decide the answers to some of these questions. And because this is a classroom management presentation, I'm just wondering, and you guys don't have to answer this question, but again, that highlighted, that bolded question, whose classroom management style do we use? That's something you need to discuss. And hopefully that's not just that one time. That's something that you establish over repeated meetings. And then think about which questions take longer to discuss and which ones you can answer on the fly, right? Let's go to the next slide. Okay. Here's the same thing. There's a long list of questions. These are all important questions to ask, especially if you have the time and the bandwidth to get together with your co-teacher and talk about what are the objectives, okay? And how do these inform classroom management? So I do want you to take a second to put in the chat, just use the number of the question. So just read through those questions. What do you think are the 3 most important questions to ask when it comes to working with your co-teacher on classroom management? which of these 9 questions, which 3 would best apply to an effective classroom management scheme? And you can just put 1, 3, 4, 6, 7, 2, or whatever. Okay, Louise says 6, 7, 9. Okay, interesting. All right. Jackie, 1, 4, 6. What are the lesson objectives? Okay. All right. I'm looking for similarities in your answers. I see a lot of 6s. 1, 2, 3. Almost everybody chose 6. I see a lot of 5s and a decent amount of 9s as well. So 5s, 6s, and 9s. Okay. Okay, interesting. I love that. Of course, all of these questions are important, right? And number 9, that's a little bit hard to answer in some cases. And something that you have to remember, I've been wanting to mention this, is that you're going to fail. You're going to fail hard. Okay, you're going to fail hard in terms of planning a lesson. You're going to fail hard when it comes to managing a classroom. You're going to fail and fail and fail. And each time you fail, you're going to learn awesome stuff. And the more you fail, the better you'll be at a teacher, at teaching. So when it comes to all of these things, if you're not sure of what the best question to ask is, just ask them all. Take the time to get together with your co-teacher. And like Kara said, sometimes you have to be the one who initiates that contact. I haven't been in your shoes exactly, but I've been in other co-teaching situations. I spent 6-7 years doing that, and I often had to hunt the teacher down. And so it's just part of ensuring that once you step into the classroom, things will run as smoothly as possible. It's finding that teacher, taking the time to say, hey, what are the lesson objectives? What are we going to do here? What do I need to prepare, right? How can we make sure that our classroom is managed as effectively as possible? All right, let's go to the next slide. So just a couple quick tips, right? Routine, like Kara said, stand at the front of the classroom every day or every time there's a class. That really helps. Start the class the same way so the students know what to expect. End the class the same way so they know what to expect. Don't go big from the very beginning. Take your time, feel out the environment, right? And then when you start to get a little bit more comfortable with your co-teacher, maybe you can start to look at those different co-teaching models. And you can say, hey, why don't we try the alternative approach? Why don't we try stations? Okay. Let's go to the next slide. Kara said this a million times. I'm going to say it a million more. Communication is key. You have to communicate. Think about the relationships you have in your private lives or your professional lives. Nothing gets done without good communication. So if your co-teacher keeps coming up to you 5 minutes before class, and during the class you find that you're struggling to maintain any sense of order, and that it feels like the students just aren't learning anything, that there's no management happening at all, communicate that to the teacher in a respectful way, right? Ask them, what do we do when someone shouts something out? What do we do when someone acts out? How do we manage behavior in this classroom? How do we change from activity to activity? Okay, do we have a reward system? All of these things will help you work with your co-teacher when it comes to managing that classroom. Planning is key, communication is key. So if we look at the next slide, this is a really, really helpful worksheet, or just not really worksheet, but this is a really helpful paper that you can print out and work together on with your co-teacher. And if you look at the questions in that left-hand column, if you take the time to put down what you think your response would be to each of those classroom management issues, and sit down with your co-teacher or co-teachers and go through them, you can start to make plans for the next time an issue creeps up in class. So I think we'll find a way to get this worksheet to you, and then when you walk into your schools, this can be something that you already have ready, that you already have prepared, and you can sit down with your co-teacher and go through the questions. And as things change, as the context change, as you become more comfortable, your answers may change too, and then you can revisit some of these conversations. So yeah, just something to think about. But again, if there's only one thing you come away with from this my quick talk, it's communicate. Communicate with your teachers as often as possible. Be respectful. Be aware of how they may see you, but still talk about how you feel when it comes to students saying swear words or whatever else it is that whatever other issues, what was it, what the hell, if a student keeps saying that all the time, bring it up to your co-teacher and say, how can we manage this in a productive way, in an effective way? So yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening.
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks, Tom. So I'm just going to set up the discussion to follow after a 15-minute break. I know we're all ready for break time, but before we do that, I'm going to preface the 2 video segments that we want you to watch. I just popped the links into the chat box. So in the first video, the context is 6th grade, and you'll be observing ETA Abby in action. And I only want you to watch from about the 20-second mark to 6 minutes and 12 seconds. So make note of that. And then in the second video, the context is 5th grade. You'll be watching ETA Connor. So watching from 1:55 to 6:08. So for each, you're just watching a segment of the full video. Of course, later on, you could go back and watch the entirety of the lesson if you wanted to. So go ahead and watch these 2 segments during the break. And then Kara, if I can have the next slide. And then these are the things that we want you to be looking out for. And they are things that we've already covered in this workshop. So as you're watching, look for routines or systems that are in place that might help set the rules, boundaries, and expectations. This is going back to what Kara covered regarding classroom management components. So we're going to talk about that. You can take notes. And then the next is, what types of co-teaching dynamics or model, if you can identify the model or models, were actually implemented in both classrooms. And then the last one is, what are some ways both ETAs built rapport with students? Any questions about what you're doing during the break? Okay, so I have about 10:50 morning in Taipei right now. Let's go ahead and meet back at 11:05 or 05. So that'll give us 15 minutes. Questions, comments? Okay. See you back in 15 minutes. Okay, it's 11:05 in Taiwan, and we're back. Hopefully that was very helpful for you to see all of this contextualized. Could you imagine yourselves in these scenarios? Just pop something in the chat box so I know you're still there. It could just be a yes or yay. Great. Yay. Like the enthusiasm. Thanks, guys. All right, so let's go ahead and look back to our discussion questions. What were some specific routines and or systems that you observed which really play a role in classroom management? This could be in either Abby's class or Connor's. And again, you can just type this into the chat box. If you want to identify which classroom, you could put Abby in front first or Connor. So any type of classroom routine or task. Abby's class had a warm-up activity, repeat sentence 3 times, yes. A lot of repetition, right? Expectations reward system for starting class. Okay. What about right at the beginning in Abby's class? Yes. So there seemed to be some sort of system for entering the classroom, right? Because they waited a few seconds before everybody was let in. Connor, review with pictures. Yeah, some review to prior lesson. Anything else? Did you feel like both contexts were quite orderly in the way the lesson flowed? Granted, you were just watching a small segment of each. Yes? Okay. So the next question is, what type of co-teaching model, or you could maybe identify a strategy, did you observe in both Abby's and Connor's classes? Team teaching, okay, so tag team. One teach, one support. I think there was a little bit of an assistant role, so one lead, one assist in both, but definitely team tagging as well, or tag team. Yeah, Abby and her co-teacher seemed very much in sync, especially with giving directions, and both had sort of TPR going on with their gestures. Okay, so next question having to do with co-teaching models is, based on what you observed, just a brief segment of each, did you think this was effective, or maybe what could have been better or more enhanced? So these were recorded formal observations. They were pretty good, but if there's anything that you could comment in regards to, what maybe could have been better, or if you can imagine yourself in this situation, what would you have wanted more of or less of, perhaps? Or you could just point out maybe some role switching in Connor's, okay? Thank you. But overall, it was effective in both. Abby and her LET were co-teaching. They would look at each other. Yeah, acknowledgement, right? To show that they're a team. I agree. Anything else? Okay, and then what are some ways both ETAs built rapport with the students? So aside from their co-teachers having rapport with whoever you're teaching with, obviously you need to build rapport with your students. So what were some things that helped that connection? Humor, good. Yeah, both were very enthusiastic. Anything else? Reward system, good. We covered that earlier in the slide as a strategy. Friendliness and enthusiasm. Yeah. So be friendly, but not necessarily a friend. Lots of checking in. Called students by English names. Okay, yeah, definitely. All right, so let's go to the next slide because now I want you to imagine yourselves as ETAs in the classroom and connecting back to what Kara outlined in terms of components of classroom management, building that rapport, setting rules, boundaries, and expectations, and early, finding the root of the problem. So these would be issues that you anticipate. And then involving parents and guardians. What are specific things that you can do when you're here to address either of these components? And instead of typing this in the chat box, we have a slightly smaller group this time, so about 30 in total. If you could just unmute yourselves, you don't have to raise your hand. It's okay if we overlap a little bit, but if I could just hear a few of you give examples out loud. Don't be shy. So any examples of how to build rapport, set rules, boundaries, or expectations, getting to the root of the problem, or involving parents and guardians?
One thing I've heard from other teachers about setting rules and expectations and things is it helps to go over things like kind of at the beginning of your time teaching and then maybe have it like written down or have it somewhere where you can reference it in the classroom.
Yeah, thanks, Kenzie. Thanks for speaking out loud. Anybody else? I know you're out there. I can see your faces.
In the past, I kind of, in terms of building rapport, setting aside kind of like a question time almost, where teachers can ask students about themselves and students can ask the teachers about themselves so that there's kind of a back and forth to it.
Yeah, an introduction with a Q&A. Yeah, I like that. Anybody else?
Sorry, my camera is not really working well, but
That's okay, Madeline.
sometimes to find the root of the problem, I have like students like restate what we think, like what the objective is we're talking about to kind of understand where they're at in like following the topic and what they're thinking about.
Yeah, that's a really great idea. Have them reiterate or reflect back to what was taught to check for understanding. If it's an older, audience, or if they're at that level, that's a great way to check in. Yeah, getting to the root of the issue. Okay, anybody else? It's really nice to hear your voices, by the way.
I have one. I think for setting rules, I admired how in one of the videos, one of the ETAs, it may have just been rules for the activity, but he kind of turned like the statement of the rules into like a shout out loud repetition exercise. I thought that was really effective.
Yeah, there are
That's
different
something I
ways.
would do.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Grace. So there are different ways to give instructions as well as deliver rules, right? You don't have to just go down a list. Good observation. Let's have one more bold speaker out there.
Hi, I think that one way to build rapport is to have really open body language and being able to show that you're like a really friendly person based on how you hold yourself and how you have maybe like open palms or open hands, and like you look really confident in what you're teaching.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Allison. So body language, different gestures, different ways to show like a welcoming presence. Yeah, thank you. These are all great ideas. Kara is going to go ahead and bring you back to more strategies, okay? But do keep these components in mind, the building the rapport, the setting the rules, boundaries, and expectations, getting to the root of the issue, and then involving parents and guardians, which we probably have less concrete examples at this point, but this will certainly come into play once you start assisting or teaching at your schools.
All right. Thanks for all of that. I recommend if you have time at some point, especially once you're in quarantine, take a look at those videos and in their entirety. I think there's a lot of things to be gleaned from there. Both of those are examples of really like ideal co-teaching situations. And I want to just say kind of as a disclaimer that, you know, and you're hearing this a lot, I know, what you are going to walk into it will be very different, each of you. So there isn't going to be a typical experience that we can prepare you for, but we want to show you the good stuff to know what that can look like in Taiwan for sure. But with that said, I do want to say that a lot of our teachers that we're working with, especially if you're in TIE, this is a new site for us. So all the schools that are participating in this program this year, and TIE in particular, are going to be new for us. And that might be the case for some of the other schools that you're working with. That means that they haven't had the experience of working with an ETA before. They're also learning, just as you are, and how to work with you. And many of the teachers that you are working with will not necessarily have had training or experience co-teaching before. So this is also why we're really pushing and encouraging that you initiate a lot of this conversation and talk, and trying to give you tools to help you feel a bit more comfortable in navigating those waters. We're going to have another workshop that specifically addresses co-teaching, and we hope it's one that your future LETs will be able to participate in as well. And that will be happening probably in the beginning of October. So just know that we'll be definitely exploring this topic, as Tom mentioned, in greater detail. One thing that our Google Classroom is asking you to reflect upon today is attention getters. A lot of veteran teachers have their kind of go-to ways of getting students' attention, and it's helpful to find out what your LETs or local content teachers, the teachers you're going to be working with, what they do to do this. Some common ones that I've seen are the teacher will say attention, and the students will say 1, 2. That's a really easy one and a common one that's used. Sometimes I've seen teachers say eyes on me, and the students reply eyes on you. But there's a lot of different ways we can get students' attention. Some of these are more playful that we see in the graphic here. And if you look at the source listed on this website, on this slide, there's a great YouTube video where I've pulled a lot of the ones I'm about to suggest to you. And I recommend, it's a quick watch, maybe 2 minutes or so, and can give some really fun ways of getting students' attention. One way is to say, if you can hear my voice, and then have some sort of motion. It could be like, if you hear my voice, match me. You can do some different funny gestures and have students mimic you. Another one is hands on top, and then students repeat, that means stop. Another one is waterfall fingers. So you can say, if you can hear my voice, or show me waterfall fingers, and then shh, bumpity bump bump, and students say bump bump. Or you can say alligator, alligator, and students go chomp, chomp. That's a fun one. This one is really effective at getting students to be quiet. You can say, if you can hear my voice, put a bubble in your mouth, and students will go, or put a marshmallow. They may not know what a marshmallow is, but just the virtue of doing it will cause them to be quiet. And you could do another one, crowd hush. So if you can hear my voice, you know, or a hush fell over the crowd, and it's kind of like a wave movement, and go shh when everyone does it together. The video does a much better job of explaining these. So if these are ones that sound interesting to you, I recommend checking them out. But I think it's helpful, regardless of what you do, make sure that it's something you teach your students and you revisit frequently. You cannot expect students to know that what you're doing is an attention getter unless you explicitly teach them. So make sure that anything new that you introduce is something you go over and practice before relying on it to do what its intended purpose is. All right. So one area where we see a lot of breakdown happen, where students start to disengage and a lesson can kind of fall apart, is in the instruction giving phase. So I want to take a moment to really talk about how to give effective instructions. And this is something that takes practice at doing. As Tom mentioned, you're probably going to fail at things. This might be one of those areas that will take some practice before you really feel maybe confident in how you give instructions. Generally, what I see a lot of is we talk too much. We use way too much language. And we want to rely on some of those scaffolds that we introduced last week, like modeling and gesturing. But ultimately, whatever you do, keep it simple. Use short sentences. Don't have lengthy explanations. So KIS, keep it simple, KISS, hence the little graphic there, if that helps you. Make sure you're speaking slowly and clearly, and you may need to repeat yourself a few times. This is really important. Think about how you are receiving new information in a language that is new for you. Probably the first time it's said to you, you're not going to get it right away. I also think this is very key, and a lot of teachers, even your LETs, might need reminding of this, is to wait to give instructions only after you have everyone's attention. Very often we get impatient, we have limited time, we want to move through the lesson quickly, and I see teachers very often giving instructions when there's still kids who are not attentive, who are distracted, who are doing other things. So this is where using those attention getters can be really important before you start giving instructions to help make sure that everyone is giving you their undivided attention. Really important that you do some checks for understanding and find different ways that you are repeating instructions. I recommend making sure that instructions are repeated 2 to 3 times before you actually begin. So this is another reason why you want to keep things short and simple, because you're going to repeat them. And incorporating those sort of strategies, I think, will help with student comprehension a great deal. As we mentioned, one of you had mentioned in your comment to Effie, having a visual to refer to is really helpful. So if you are using kind of common classroom language around instructions, helpful to have posters of this in the classroom. A lot of Taiwanese elementary classrooms in particular don't really put a lot of focus in the way that we see in American classrooms on decor in the classroom. So if this is an area that you feel like you can contribute, you know, that can be an easy way to have an easy to refer to reinforcement. Always have easy to understand examples, model whenever possible. And you want to make sure you're checking for understanding. And what do we mean by that? Well, one thing that a lot of people do is they'll ask, do you understand? So we're going to go through some different ways people check for understanding, but not all of them are created equal. Some of these are much, much better and more effective. And some of them I really recommend not doing. And we'll talk about this quickly here. But just as we go through, I would love to see what you feel about it. So if you think it's a great check for understanding, thumbs up. And if you think, no, this is not a good check for understanding, thumbs down. Okay? So very often, just as I did right there, okay, do you understand? Is that a good check for understanding? Thumbs up or thumbs down? Or that chat box, no, it is not a good one. Why? Because anybody can say yes or no. It doesn't really tell you what is not understood. And very often when we don't understand, we don't want attention on us. So when we employ this, you're not going to get an accurate reaction from students very often. How about asking, what is the first step? Yes, no? Yeah, this helps to break down the directions. So you can ask, what is the first step? Ask then another student, what's the next step? And having students to help repeat is one way that you can repeat the instructions step by step. It also helps you to organize them in your delivery. Ask students to repeat back the instructions, yes or no? Yeah, yep, exactly. And sometimes this might be where you can have students repeat them back in native language if you've given them in English. And that can help be another way to reinforce things and a constructive way to use native language in the classroom. Ask students to demonstrate the activity to the class. Yay or nay? Yes, that's a great way to help students model. That really shows their understanding, and it creates a little bit more fun around instructions as well. Ask, what do you think you need to do? Yes or no? I see a thumbs up, some thumbs up, a little bit more hesitancy with this. You're not sure, maybe so. I'm going to give it a thumbs up. This might be appropriate for students with more language. It may be too vague for students who are younger learners or more beginning level. So be careful with this question. It's not a bad one, but if your students don't have the language to understand it, don't use it. Ask students to turn to their neighbor and repeat the instructions. Yay or nay? See some thumbs up, some so, some pointing down. We're kind of all over on this one. So I think generally it's okay, but here's where you want to, it works really well if you are monitoring students during this. If you just are staying at the front of the classroom and telling students to turn and talk, you don't know what they're talking about. They could be talking about, you know, things that are absolutely irrelevant to the class. So when this is happening, it's your job and your co-teacher's job to be monitoring and moving around the classroom and listening in to make sure that they are sharing the correct instructions. Otherwise, it's not super effective. And lastly, to just check once. Is that a good strategy or not so good strategy? Yeah, Madeline, you're right. Not a good strategy. We want to make sure that we're having more than one check for understanding. So the more we can repeat directions, the more we can check for understanding, the more likely our students will know what to do when the time comes to do the activity, and the more success our lesson will be. And that also means the better things will flow and less management issues will arise. Just real quick as we start to wrap things up, these are some easy to implement tools, and I'm going to ask you, if you think you know what one is, to list the number and what you think it is in the chat box, or you can unmute and share what your idea is verbally.
I think 5 is the one to attention getters, to get people to quiet down or pay attention.
You got it. Good job. Thank you. Any others? Who's feeling brave?
One is an exit ticket.
How did you guess? Yes.
I'm a smart guy.
I loved exit tickets because they created that routine. My kids knew to line up in class at the end. It was expected that they would have to talk to me. It was a way for me to assess very quickly what the lesson's objective was. And because they knew that that was coming, that helped them to pay a little bit more attention in class because they knew there was something performative. Madeline, you're absolutely right. Number 3 is a seating chart, a seating plan. A lot of teachers will have that. It may be helpful if you are in a classroom that is in that single file desk situation. If you want to implement group work, to pre-plan how students' seating might look if they're working in groups, and to work with your co-teacher on establishing that. But seating charts are really great too if you have disruptive students and moving them around. Very often seating charts, the seating chart that you'll walk into is students sitting according to their number. So student 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, kind of in numerical order. But that doesn't mean that it's the optimal order. So that'll be helpful. I missed a couple of the other comments. I'm sorry, just because of the technology. So number 2, bonus card reward system. Yes, this is an example of that. Stamps are really popular here, and you might get one. One was gifted to me by my LAT that had my name on it. And they're pretty inexpensive to get in stationery stores. So it's a good way to implement a bonus card type system, but something to ask your co-teacher about. Any others? I'm sorry if I missed your comments. They come up and flash on the screen and then they go down and I can't access it the way I have things set up on the computer right now for presenting. So we talked a lot about positivity and presence, and I really recommend that making yourself mobile in the classroom. Don't just stay at the front of the classroom, that kind of safe stage space. Really move about the classroom. Learn kids' names as soon as you can, as well as you can. Find opportunities, because you can also call in kids when you start to see things arise. And that shows that you know who they are, that you have eyes on them, and that very often can help correct minor behavior issues as well. One quick website I recommend checking out, it's called app.classroomscreen.com. This is a fun classroom tool, and a lot of classrooms you're going to find in Taiwan will have a class computer and LCD projector. This has a lot of tools embedded in it, including a dice roller, a timer, stopwatch, even like a noise indicator. And yeah, I recommend checking out and playing with it. It might be something that you find useful to use, especially once you're in person in the classroom. So we're coming to our conclusion here, although classroom management is definitely an issue that doesn't conclude ever. And certainly will be one that you will continue to perhaps be challenged by in some respects, one way or another, as you make your way into the classroom. And again, as I mentioned before, we'll be revisiting that as a topic in a future workshop later in the semester, once we have you all here. On Thursday this week, just to let you know, we'll have another workshop. This will be on approaches to teaching, and really diving more into activities you can do utilizing the textbook. And don't forget, if you're able to, I know a lot of you are working and have other commitments outside of this, but if you're able to get to some of those classroom assignments on Google Classroom, today's is to write 3 attention-getting techniques that you want to adopt in your classroom. So thinking about some of those that I very briefly introduced to you, and maybe you have some other ideas of things that you've used in the past that work well. And later this week, one of the assignments will be asking you to list 10 activities that you think can be adopted effectively for teaching English based on the textbook. And hopefully our workshop on Thursday will help to give you some ideas for that. If you have any questions, please let us know. We'll be hanging out here for a few minutes. And otherwise, thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in today. I know it's quite late where you are, and we're growing ever more excited to get you here the closer those flight dates are coming. So thanks, everyone. Have a great one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.